go? Cool. Might as well get started. I don't think anyone's going to tell me to start. So, I just want to start today by saying thank you for coming to see my talk. It's quite nerve-wracking as one of the non-technical speakers to be here sort of sharing some of this information with you today. But it's really nice to see lots of people that are interested in learning a little bit about my field of interest, which is psychology. And I'm hoping that you can all take something away from it today that will be applicable to your lives too. So, for those of you who don't know me, because I know there are a few colleagues in the audience, thank you. I'm Jess. What to say? So I'm an avid reader. I'm obsessed with dogs. And I'm devoted to my cat Garfield. But really, above all else, I am a psychology nerd. I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Nottingham in psychology and cognitive neuroscience, what feels like ages ago now. And I then went on to do a master's in entrepreneurship and innovation. So what I'm really interested in is that intersection of psychology and technology and how we can bring some of the principles of psychology to the tech world to increase that engagement with our products. So I've been lucky enough to put my passion to work at Tully, which is a financial technology startup here in Nottingham. And Tully is aiming to get digital debt advice out to people that are struggling financially to get them back on track with their money. Now what I do at Tully is I'm a product owner for money coaching, it started as a seed of an idea and we've grown it from that to actually launching in just a few weeks' time. And what makes it a little bit different to most personal financial management tools is it's designed around a framework of behavioural psychology. And because we're coming close to launch now, I've sort of been reflecting on that journey and some of the things that we've sort of done along the way that have really helped us build that product. So now I'm on a bit of a mission to bring the principles of psychology to the world of tech. I'm coining a really metal term at the same time, that I'm hoping can help you guys with any future products that you think might need to use some sort of behavioural change. So what I've been engaging with, without even really realising it, was something called behavioural design. So what is that? Well, behavioural design is the application of behavioural sciences, cognitive neuroscience and behavioural economics to affect some sort of behaviour change. It might sound quite niche or quite complicated, but actually behavioural design is inherent in the product development process. And that's because as businesses, we're usually trying to get some sort of success measure that relies on some form of change of behaviour from our customers. Now, whether that's simply a payment for the value that we're providing, whether it's the contribution of user-generated content, or whether it's even just the way that we expect our customers to engage with our products. But behaviour change is really difficult. And we can't expect to achieve it if we don't actually put any thought into how our products are designed to support or influence it. So what I want to do today is I want to share with you one of the most effective frameworks for effective behaviour change. And it's one that really is simple enough for you guys to take it away and implement it yourselves. And in case you haven't guessed already, that framework is the feedback loop. So to start with, I'm going to tell you a story. So back in 2003 in California, the community in Garden Grove were facing a problem. It's a problem that's faced in towns across the US, and it's one that we recognise here in the UK as well. And that problem was drivers were speeding through their school zones and causing a multitude of accidents with cyclists and pedestrians. Now, the local authority had tried loads of different tactics to try and tackle this. They've replaced all the old speed limit signs with shiny new ones, so that wasn't an excuse anymore. And they increased the number of speeding tickets that they issued during pick-up and drop-off hours. But these tactics were really quite ineffective, so engineers decided to try something new, something that hadn't been tested before. What they did, using radar technology, they created the dynamic speed display. And this showed the legal speed limit And using the radar technology, it showed a digital readout of the driver's current speed they were travelling at. Now this approach defied decades of law enforcement experience because it didn't tell the drivers anything new, and there were no consequences at all if the drivers decided to ignore it. But the results were really fascinating. In the vicinity where the dynamic speed displays were rolled out, drivers actually slowed down an average of 14%. And at 3 of the schools, the average speed actually dipped below the posted speed limit, which apparently is really good. Well, that was the point, but yeah. So since this trial, dynamic speed displays have been rolled out internationally as part of the Safer Routes to Schools scheme. And studies have actually shown that in areas where they're used, the speed drops by an average of 8 miles per hour. And that's, again, to put that into context for you, that's a gain of 8 metres when braking to avoid hitting the child. So it's really quite significant results. So what's going on here? I think let's delve into some of the theory behind this feedback loop and what makes it so effective. And to start with, what I want to do is I want to get you into the mind of a psychologist. It's nothing weird, don't we? So let's start with some basic behaviourism. So B.F. Skinner and his colleagues refined the principle of operant conditioning through his work with animals. What they did is they used positive and negative reinforcement to associate specific consequences with voluntary behaviours. And they then refined the rewards or the punishments to shape that behaviour into a specific outcome. So they'd start with something simple, something like a naturally occurring behaviour. They'd reinforce it with a reward or a punishment, and then they'd gradually make that narrower and narrower until the animals were performing quite complex tasks. Now, if any of you have ever trained a pet, you'll have experienced this firsthand. So this owner, for example, training this very good boy, might have started by rewarding the dog when it pawed at her hand for a treat. She'll have then refined that reward to only reward the dog when she gave her hand and it gave its paw. And then she might have refined it even further to, in this case, a voice command or maybe even lifting her foot. So what's happening here? Let's have a look at the loop. We've got an existing behaviour, and then we have a stimulus. We have the response behaviour in response to the stimulus, which elicits an effect on the environment. And then we use the reward or the punishment to reinforce that behaviour. Now what Skinner and colleagues would do is they would go around this loop multiple times until that reinforcement was eliciting the response behaviour much more reliably at the start. And as I said before, they would narrow that down until it was a really specific outcome. Now, when we think about it, this is what the local authority in California were trying to do. They were using speeding tickets as a punishment for drivers who weren't showing the desired behaviour change. But in this loop, reinforcement is clearly key. And actually, if we look at our dynamic speed displays, there is no reinforcement. So what's actually happening here to make it have such an amazing impact? Well, as humans, while we're certainly still susceptible to training via operant conditioning, we have a much more complex reward and cognition system, which you guys will know as the brain. And that actually responds to a much wider range of reinforcements. So in the feedback loop with the dynamic speed displays, what we have, instead of a simple stimulus, we have a comparator. And that shows any disparity between a measure of existing behaviour, which for the dynamic speed displays is the speed the driver is travelling at, and a reference value, which is the legal speed limit. This here is the feedback loop, and it is the basis for all manner of biological, social and cognitive phenomena. But devoid of any form of reinforcement, you're probably thinking, why does this work? What makes this work so well? Well, what we've actually got going on is something in between this comparator and the response behaviour. And it's another comparison, but this time it's internal. See, as we all grow into adults, we all develop an internal construct. And that's made up of beliefs and values that we hold of the world and others and of ourselves. We develop this without even realising it, although I have heard that it's quite popular to go and find it in Thailand nowadays, but don't believe the hype, you don't need to do that. So what happens without realising thousands of times a day is we actually compare our actions against this internal construct. And if our actions don't align with the beliefs and the values that we hold of ourselves, that's when we experience something called cognitive dissonance. So cognitive dissonance is that experience if your actions don't line up with your internal beliefs and values. Sometimes it can be an incredibly uncomfortable feeling. Sometimes it can pass by without us really consciously noticing it at all. So let's take our speed displays as an example. Now, our internal construct is probably that we are moral, law-abiding citizens who don't go around just endangering the lives of school children, right? So what's happening is when that digital speed display is showing a comparison of our actions with a command, the legal speed limit, that is in line with our internal construct, we get that rise in cognitive dissonance. And what's really interesting now is, in light of that experience, humans actually react in one of four ways. So, they might justify the behaviour by changing what they think. Oh, I don't care about speeding, I don't care about the law. They might justify the behaviour by adding another thought. So, oh, I'll be really careful and extra vigilant while I'm speeding through this area. They might completely ignore or deny the information. So actually, if I speed through this school zone and a pedestrian just comes out in front of me, there's nothing I can do about that. Slowing down isn't going to make a difference. Or they change the behaviour. They slow down. So it's this change in behaviour that alleviates the cognitive dissonance that makes this feedback loop so effective. And it really is powerful because with very little cost, because you've got no extrinsic reward or punishment, you can affect really big changes in behaviour. Okay, so now I've done the theory bit, that's the boring bit, or interesting, hopefully it's interesting. Is everyone still with me?
Yeah.
Cool, right. If anyone's got any questions about that bit, then feel free to ask them now. What I'm going to do next is dive into how you can actually think about implementing a feedback loop in your product, processes, or personal life. And I'll give you some hopefully interesting examples along the way as well. Okay. So I think we can implement a feedback loop in roughly 5 steps, and that depends how much of a Cambridge Analytica you want to be about step 5. Hopefully not very. Yeah. I'm glad you laughed at that because, yeah, you never know. So over the next 20 minutes, let's dive into each of these in more detail and have a look at some interesting case studies. So number 1. Now, this is a user researcher's dream, but really it's super important to understand this because with cognitive dissonance playing such a vital role in the feedback loop, if you don't understand that internal construct of your customers, you're highly unlikely to show them a behaviour that they're interested in, that they care about, and if they don't care about it, they're not going to get that rise in cognitive dissonance, and then they're highly unlikely to change their behaviour in response to that. So it's no surprise really that the feedback loop has been incredibly effective in the surge in baby tech. And that's because if you think about parents, probably most mothers and fathers have beliefs that they are good parents and values that they care about their family and their children. Now, in line with this, Owlet have really honed in on this opportunity and created a baby sock wearable that measures all manner of different metrics, including heart rate, oxygen levels, and sleep quality. Now, what they say they're doing is they're empowering parents to improve the health of their children by testing and adapting their behaviours to lead to the best results. So a good example of this might be a parent who uses Owlet's baby wearable to measure the sleep quality of their child as they adapt the feeding patterns. So by doing this, they can figure out which feeding pattern works best and gets the best health outcome for the baby. So just to be really clear, the feedback loop here is that Owlet are using wearable tech to surface data that was previously not comparable for parents so that they can change their behaviours to get the best outcomes for the baby. Now, for those of us in the room who don't have children, maybe we've got faux babies instead. Now, PitPat is a pet wearable, these are all real examples, by the way, is a pet wearable that tracks your dog's activity. Like how PitPat have surfaced data that was previously inaccessible to pet owners, so that they can sort of compare the metrics and change their behaviours to improve the health and well-being of their dogs. So it's all very well and good talking about beliefs and values, but I do appreciate that this can feel a little bit fluffy, and it can feel a little bit like, how do you actually get to those beliefs and values? And I really could take up another hour of talking about techniques to actually get there. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce you to one technique, my favourite, which some of my colleagues will already be aware of, and that's called laddering. Now, laddering is my favourite technique because it involves acting like a petulant 5-year-old child whose only question is why. Now, the technique was actually devised by clinical psychologists in the 60s to get to the root of behaviour and belief, so it really is incredibly effective. Although, when we started using this in our focus groups, people do get really annoyed when you keep asking them why, because it's quite a difficult question to answer. So to give you an example of where we use this, at Tully, obviously digital death advice, we were interested in why do people not answer the phone to their creditors when they call? Pretty simple question. So we asked the question to the group, and we got answers such as, oh, it interrupts me, I'm really busy and I don't want to answer the phone because I'm super busy and it's really inconvenient. So, okay, well tell us more about that. So why is that annoying that it's interrupting you? Well, actually, it's annoying because it means that I might sign up to a repayment plan that I can't afford. All right, so you might want to leave it there. Okay, that's annoying. You know, the consequence of that is they're signing up to something they can't afford. Everyone can appreciate why that's not a good thing. But actually, if we dig one level deeper and say, why is it important not to sign up to a repayment plan you can't afford? Actually, that's when we started to get to the values. And people said things like, I was brought up to repay all the money that I borrowed. I don't want to let my creditors down. I don't want to feel like, I'm not meeting my obligations. And actually having that information was really crucial to us because we could understand the mindset of our customers and their internal constructs when we were trying to change their repayment behaviour. Okay, so let's move on to our next point, and this is around choosing the behaviour to measure, which is appropriate. So when we're trying to achieve a specific business outcome, quite often there are more than one behaviour involved in this. And it's really important that we actually get to the correct behaviour when we're taking our measurements. Now, with the rise of wearables, and I know I've already talked about a couple of wearables because feedback loops are really prolific in this space, but there are a lot of products that measure everything and anything. And for the wearable tech market, that's okay because the value of those products is that they do that. They measure everything. But for most of us in the room, our businesses are probably trying to achieve one particular change in behaviour. So what we need to do to start with is we need to understand what behaviours we're trying to measure, and then the second thing to make sure is to make sure that the metric actually maps directly onto that behaviour. A good story to think about here is something called the Cobra effect. And this happened with the Indian government. So they had a problem where in Delhi there were actually a lot of venomous cobras that were causing a lot of deaths. So what they did is, in order to combat the problem, they said, right, we'll pay a bounty. Everyone who brings me a dead cobra, I'll make you a payment. So the tactic worked really well to begin with. People started bringing them dead cobras and they're like, yeah, this is great. Until what started to happen was people started to breed snakes, to kill them, to bring them in as a source of income. And that wasn't so good, so the government went, oh no, we don't want that to happen, so we'll stop, we're not going to pay you anymore. So then all of the worthless cobras that had been bred by the breeders were then released back into the wild, and actually that just made the whole problem a lot worse. So in this story, obviously, the government hadn't really considered how their metric mapped directly onto the behaviour they were looking for. So they were looking for people to kill wild cobras, but they hadn't thought about how actually asking people to bring dead cobras into them might not have the intended effects. And I think the other thing to point on in that story is because they brought in extrinsic motivation, and we talked about reinforcement earlier, because they brought in that extrinsic motivation, actually, where you can measure something, you can game it. And when you start to reward people for certain behaviours, you must expect to have some form of gaming the system. So it's really important to think about that. Okay, so moving on to point 3, and this is far more out of my comfort zone than it probably is out of your comfort zone. But if we think back to our dynamic speed display example, actually without the clever use of the radar technology, they probably wouldn't have been able to close that feedback loop. And there are lots of different ways that we can start measuring behaviour with new hardware and technology that's really getting quite interesting. So let's look at some of the companies on the market here. So Stride they've developed a small shoe-worn pod that clips onto your shoelaces, and it actually measures the vertical, horizontal and lateral movements of your foot in order to calculate running power. What it then does is, using Bluetooth, is it connects to your smartphone or your smartwatch, and it sends you those stats in real time so you can track it as you're running. Another good example is this company called Upright, who have created this Go monitor. Now this is a nifty little device that sticks onto your back, and it contains a tilt sensor. So it actually tracks whether you're leaning forwards too much or not. They've obviously coupled this with their app interface in order to show people that real-time feedback. But it's really interesting to think about how different measurements using different forms of hardware can be really quite successful. Now, I am conscious again that I do keep talking about wearables, so I'm going to bring it back to something that isn't about wearable technology. And like our initial dynamic speed display, measuring behaviour doesn't have to be done physically. So there's lots of new technologies emerging that can help with this, and I wanted to touch on open banking, mostly because I know enough about it to talk about. So for those of you that haven't come across open banking before, it's a new government initiative that's mandated that all banks need to develop APIs that allow their customers to securely share their transactional data with third-party providers. So up until now, much of the focus on open banking has been at a platform level, but actually we're starting to see some really interesting applications of this technology. And because transactional data gives us a really rich insight into not only spending behaviour, but also, where people are going and what they're doing, what they're engaging with, actually we've got a really good opportunity to close some feedback loops here. Now, a bit of a shameless plug on this one, because this is how we are using feedback loops and open banking technology in our product, Money Coaching. So what we do is we analyse customers' open banking transactional data, and we produce these personalised and achievable challenges for them to help them save money. So this forms the reference value, the reference value for them to be aiming for. What we then do is we track their real-time spending progress, and we show this to them so they can see their progress in the challenge, and then we show them whether they've passed or failed. So by using their financial data in this way, we are helping them exercise self-control. We're helping them change their financial habits and to build up a savings buffer. Okay. So moving on to number 4, and I think I've sort of started to touch on this a bit already. But you know what your customers care about, you know which behaviour you want to measure, and you've got a mechanism to actually make that measurement. But because data is great, just because data is great, it doesn't mean it's useful to users. So I think this is sort of, this point is in 2 parts. And number 1 is you've got to make the data that you gather usable by the system itself. And number 2 is you've got to make the data intuitive to the customer when you actually show it to them. So having an interface that's intuitive for the customer and easy to understand and act upon is absolutely critical for that comparator part of the feedback loop. And as you could probably gather, data cleaning and systems is not my forte, so we're just going to focus on the interface for this part of the talk. So the first thing really I want to touch on is showing data and using interfaces to show data. It doesn't have to be an app screen. And actually, as much as it's incredibly important to understand the beliefs and values of your customers, it's also really important to understand the context in which they'll be using your product. So this is obviously a pretty clear example, but if I'm a swimmer and I want to track my performance during my training regime, then it's pretty inconvenient to have to keep getting out of the pool to look at a tracker or to have someone there to tell me. So what the guys at Instabeat have done is they've actually developed wearable swimming goggles with a little light that actually shows you the heart rate monitor in 3 different intervals. So they have blue for low effort, green for fitness, and red for maximum performance. Now, showing this data in such a real-time way means the swimmers can actually adapt their behaviours in the pool to fit to their training regime at any given time. Now, I get really excited about this one, and this is literally because I'm such a psychology nerd, but I think this really lends some credibility. Okay, so as I was saying before the slight fire alarm interruption, this example of a feedback loop is actually my favourite. Mostly because I'm totally a psychology nerd, but also because I think this really shows the credibility of the framework for affecting behavioural change. So this example is a subset of biofeedback called neurofeedback. Neurofeedback is used by clinical neurologists to help patients treat and manage symptoms of disorders such as depression and ADHD by training particular patterns of brain activity. Now, this might feel like a bit of a difficult concept to grasp, as most of us don't spend much time focusing in on our brain activity. So let's take ADHD as an example. So people with ADHD often have difficulties with attention, focus, and the ability to sit still. How neurofeedback works is the patient wears an EEG cap to measure their brain activity, which is then displayed on a digital screen. By displaying the brain activity in real time, the patient is able to train their brain towards more positive patterns of activity. Now, something really interesting is this company in Germany who have actually used a gamified display of brain activity to further strengthen the effect of this feedback loop. As you can see in the video, they've used a dragon character to show brain activity when the individual is working hard on their executive functioning and focus skills. So the height of the dragon builds up as they maintain their focus and drops when they lose it. It's pretty cool, huh? And this is quite a nice segue into gamification, which you can actually use to augment and strengthen the feedback loops that you put in place. So gamification is the application of game design elements into products. It leverages people's natural desire for mastery, achievement, competition, and self-expression by framing the situation as gameplay. Companies like Habitica, like this one, combine their feedback loops with gamification by adding things like social proof, allowing users to collaborate and compete in order to hold each other accountable to their daily tasks. Now, gamification does tend to use some form of reinforcement, which we've talked a little bit about earlier. But the interesting thing is quite often this reinforcement is still based on intrinsic motivation. Usually the rewards have absolutely no extrinsic value, but as they represent achievement and progression to the user, they still have the same positive reinforcement effects. Now, before we move on to step 5, I really want to show you another company they're just taking the feedback loop up another notch completely. Hackrod are a company based in America, and what they've done is they've applied a feedback loop within their own process and actually cut out the human middleman entirely. They use sensors on their prototype cars to collect data and feed it back into their artificial intelligence models to directly impact their generative design process. So take a look at this video.
imagine that you could design and build the car of your dreams as easy as playing a video game? The HackRod digital manufacturing platform is connecting virtual reality with artificial intelligence and advanced manufacturing to make this dream a reality. To prove this out, we started by sketching La Bandita, the car that we wanted, but nobody made. Quickly moving from sketch to full-scale photoreal 3D model in virtual reality. Allowing us to perfect the design and aerodynamics digitally. Moving back into the physical world and connecting with the Internet of Things. We deployed sensors and scanners to capture 50 years of automotive knowledge. We harvested massive data sets and used them to teach the artificial intelligence generative design engine what a car experiences. With artificial intelligence and machine learning, we have the power of hundreds of engineers at our fingertips, allowing us to grow optimized engineering solutions for our design requirements. These designs are too complex and expensive for traditional manufacturing. They have to be 3D printed. HackRod is leading the way in large-scale metal 3D printing.
So Mouse, this is the challenge section. It's that node right there that's really going to make or break this chassis. What we're doing right here, like this is the key. Right. If we can get that node, then we can get everything.
We are now ready to print a full-scale car in aluminum. La Bandita is not a concept car. It's a proof of concept of an entirely new way to design and manufacture. And if you can build a car this way, you can build anything.
I just love how dramatic that video is. It's brilliant. So I know that here we've stepped a little bit away from changing human behaviour, and instead this feedback loop is actually changing the behaviour of their design process itself. But I really just think that it goes to show how this sort of behavioural framework can be adapted and applied in all sorts of different technological settings. And I'm sure there's a million different ways that it can be applied in the future that none of us have even thought about. All right, so let's move on to point number 5, being ethical. And I really don't think you can run a talk about behaviour change without touching on ethics. Now, the cultural theorist Paul Virilio did say that the invention of the ship was also the invention of the shipwreck. And I really believe that it's our responsibility as product owners, designers and developers to make sure that we aren't shipping impending shipwrecks. Now, with the rise in wearable technologies, we are seeing feedback loops crop up everywhere and anywhere, especially when it comes to tracking data about our own personal performance. So the quantified self movement is this trend of incorporating technology and data acquisition into daily life, often with the goal of improving physical, mental, and emotional performance. But this movement is not without its criticism. Many people claim that using data in this sense is unethical because it's too simplistic and borders on transcribing complex phenomenon into reductionist data. The movement has been criticised for providing predetermined ideas of health, of well-being and self-awareness, which actually distances the user from self-progression. And while it's possible to tap into those strong internal beliefs that we talked about earlier in order to give rise to cognitive dissonance, it doesn't always mean that you should. And it's never been more important to think carefully about any unintended consequences that your product might have. I think a good example of these negative unintended consequences is of the feedback loops that we see every day in social media. So not only are our feeds inherently relevant to our internal beliefs and values, as they're entirely personalised to what we care about, but the feedback loop is also manipulated to facilitate constantly changing reference values, this user-generated content that we see on a daily basis, which happens to maintain the user in a perpetual cycle of trying to chase fulfillment. Now, the question of ethics will always ultimately boil down to what purpose you are using your feedback loop or other psychological principles for. But there's a simple regret test that's been suggested by this behavioural psychologist, Neil, and he asks, if people knew everything the product designer knows, would they still execute the intended behaviour? And if they do, are they likely to regret it? Now, only you can honestly answer whether the way you're harnessing behavioural design is ethical, but don't leave it to chance as to whether things work out well or not. Ask the difficult questions in your teams and in your businesses and listen to honest answers. Don't be the one to build a shipwreck. So there you have the 5 steps to take if you think you'd like to implement a feedback loop into your product or process. If you're confident that you understand your customer's internal construct, you know what you're trying to achieve and the behaviours that are associated with that outcome. You have a mechanism for measuring the input and the output behaviours, and you can display the measurement in a user-friendly fashion as close to real time as possible, and that you're acting with ethical interests and within clearly drawn boundaries, then go ahead, create that feedback loop and see what happens next. Thanks very much for listening, and please do feel free to get in touch if you have any questions or comments on this talk. I hope to see you all soon. Thanks.